Helen Peterson, the first female general in the United States Army, had spent more than 30 years in the military, living quietly after years of impenetrable discipline and honor. One autumn evening, she received an invitation to the Old Town Tavern in Alexandria, Virginia, from a former comrade, Susan Walker, who had been her rival during her training years and had soon left the Army to become a human resources director for a large corporation. Susan organized a meeting for the women of the old Army, a reunion that was nominally to reminisce, but everyone understood that beneath the cheerful atmosphere lay grudges that had never dissipated. Helen entered the tavern in casual clothes, no uniform, no insignia. No one but a few familiar faces recognized her as a general, and she did not reveal it. For Susan, Helen's appearance was an opportunity to challenge, to tease, and to prove that her civilian life was more comfortable than the military service that Helen was still attached to. The seemingly innocent but meaningful questions began to ring out. Helen, haven't you retired yet? Still living alone? Helen just raised her glass and smiled faintly, not answering. The party was gradually getting lively when Susan brought in three strange men, Mike, Tom and Rick, friends of her business partner. They entered with their baseball caps pulled down, their laughter loud and the strong smell of alcohol, immediately breaking the old atmosphere. Susan introduced them superficially, as if to increase the fun. Helen sat at the end of the table, silently observing. One of the three men, Mike, turned a mocking gaze towards her. And you, why are you sitting so still like a statue? You look so serious, are you trying to scare someone? The whole table burst into laughter. Tom placed an empty glass in front of Helen and signaled, "Hey, sister, pour some wine. You were here first, so you should serve us." Helen did not react, just silently picked up the bottle of vodka and filled the glass. Her hand was so steady that not a drop fell out. Her eyes were still looking straight ahead, as if she was remembering every little detail of each person. Susan sat next to her, the corners of her mouth curved up meaningfully. Don't let her stern appearance fool you. She was famous at the training camp. A real Cerberus, everyone was afraid of her. But look at her, she's still sitting alone now. Susan's words were like a velvet-covered knife, causing the whole table to burst into laughter, while Helen only nodded slightly, not objecting. When Rick, who was already a little drunk, approached, he sneered, "Old lady, your hands are shaking, are you afraid of us?" He lightly slapped her cheek with a half-joking, half-serious slap. A moment of silence fell over the table. Helen did not turn away, did not blink, her eyes were still as straight as cold steel. While the others thought they had succeeded in making a joke, under the table, Helen's hand quietly touched the edge of her coat, where she hid her military identification card with the silver star badge and a thick list of names. That list had been passed on to the Ministry of Defense's inspection agency, and more than half of the people in this room were on that report. On the outside, Helen was still a silent middle-aged woman, enduring the ridicule. But inside, she was waiting for the right moment. In her mind, Old Town Tavern was no longer a noisy tavern but a battlefield, where every face, every gesture, every laugh was proof. With the courage of a commander, Helen did not need to shout, did not need to counterattack immediately. She knew well, the enemy often revealed their true nature when they thought they had the upper hand. And that evening, Susan Walker and those men made a fatal mistake. They slighted a general, and worse, they stirred up memories that would never fade from her mind. 20 years earlier, before Helen Peterson carried the weight of a star on her shoulder, she was just another cadet with sharper eyes and straighter posture than most of the men around her. At Fort Liberty, the training base outside Washington, D.C., she had been the first woman in her class to graduate with honors, the only one assigned directly as a company commander. Her reputation spread quickly. She was precise, unbending, and her ability to turn chaos into order on the training fields earned her the respect of some and the envy of many. Among those who watched her every move with a mixture of rivalry and resentment was Susan Walker, then still a young lieutenant. Susan hid her bitterness behind polite smiles, but her eyes always seemed to measure Helen as if searching for a weakness to exploit. At the time, Helen dismissed it as competition, nothing more than the natural friction between ambitious officers. But one night at the training center, something happened that neither ambition nor discipline could erase. A young recruit named Anna Scott was found in the barracks restroom, unconscious, with bruises on her wrists. Officially, the cause was labeled as intoxication, poor judgment for a soldier in training, but Helen had seen enough in her years to know the difference between clumsiness and abuse. She stayed by Anna's side that night, watching over her as the medics moved her, and the next day she noticed the way the girl's eyes avoided contact, the way she recoiled whenever someone of higher rank walked past. Anna was quiet, diligent, but there was a shadow hanging over her. Weeks later, when Anna was discharged for failure to meet standards, Helen's worst fears came true. Anna Scott was found dead, having taken her own life in a small apartment off base. The official statement was cold, bureaucratic, efficient, self-inflicted, off-duty. But Helen could not forget the bruises, nor the hollow look in the girl's eyes. She compiled a report, meticulously detailed, documenting the possibility of hazing, of misconduct by superior officers. In the report she did not name names directly, but she included enough to suggest that officers within the company, possibly even civilians connected to the unit, had exerted control over the recruit. She used precise language, clinical but cutting, potential non-regulation relations initiated by higher-ranking personnel within the barracks. The report was sent up the chain of command, to the Inspector General's office, and even to the Department of Defense. Helen thought she was fulfilling her duty. Instead, within weeks she was summoned to headquarters, accused of creating unnecessary suspicion, undermining morale, and damaging the Army's image. A reprimand was entered into her record, and she was reassigned effectively ex aequo a communications training unit in the frozen expanse of northern Montana. The silence of her peers was louder than any verdict. No one spoke up for her. The comrades who had once trained beside her avoided her eyes in the dining hall, in the barracks, in the courtyard. Susan Walker, however, not only stayed silent but thrived. Soon after the incident, Susan received a promotion and a transfer to the Pentagon, joining a department where her career advanced without obstacles. Helen, meanwhile, was cut out from the unit's communications, excluded from group chats and reunions, left to rebuild her career from scratch in the isolation of a cold, remote outpost. Yet exile did not break her. If anything, it honed her. In Montana, Helen changed her last name legally to Peterson, discarding the identity that had been tarnished by suspicion. She rose again, not through favoritism or connections, but through raw competence. Every training drill she ran was flawless. Every tactical report she wrote was a model. Step by step, rank by rank, she reclaimed her standing. Eventually she returned east, her name now synonymous with discipline and incorruptible standards. By the time years had passed, she was no longer just a commander, she had become a general, the first woman to command a full division, and the head of an internal task force responsible for investigating military discipline across the Army. But the memory of Anna Scott never left her. The voice of that quiet girl, the one who had once whispered that she was afraid, became a shadow Helen carried in silence. She never promised vengeance, she never vowed revenge. Instead, she bore the memory like a weight, a responsibility, something she could not let fade. Every inspection she carried out, every report she filed, every decision she made to uphold fairness in the Army, at the core of it all was the image of a young recruit who had died unheard. Susan Walker, on the other hand, built her civilian career with the same calculation she had once used to climb military ranks. She knew how to smile in public, how to manipulate perception, how to twist loyalty into silence. People remembered her as sociable, approachable, a leader who adapted to civilian life with ease. Few remembered the night Anna Scott collapsed in the restroom, or the funeral weeks later where Susan stood in black, eyes lowered, beside a man in civilian clothes, David Walker, a contractor who had unofficial ties to the training center. Helen remembered him, though. She remembered his presence at the funeral, his discreet involvement, and the whispers that circulated about contractors entertaining themselves with young recruits. In her report, his name had been marked in red, David Walker, civilian contact, suspected of involvement. The case had been buried, labeled unsubstantiated, and Helen had been punished for bringing it up. As the years unfolded, the silence hardened. Those who had been there either moved on or pretended to forget. Some suppressed guilt, others convinced themselves it had been nothing. But Helen never forgot. The day she accepted command of her division, she looked at her reflection in the mirror and whispered Anna's name. She knew her rise was not only for herself, it was for the memory of a girl the system had failed. That memory gave her the steel to endure ridicule, to remain alone, to refuse compromise even when it cost her companionship. She was alone, yes, but she was alive and she remembered. 2 decades later, when Susan invited her to Old Town Tavern under the pretense of a reunion, Helen understood immediately. This was not just a friendly gathering. It was a stage, a trap, a test of who remembered and who had buried the past. Helen came not as a guest, but as a witness prepared to see the truth resurface. When the drunken hand slapped her cheek, when the laughter rang out across the table, Helen did not flinch. She had endured worse, and she carried inside her something far heavier than insult, the unforgotten face of Anna Scott, and the responsibility to finally bring to light what had been buried 20 years ago. The air inside Old Town Tavern thickened as the night went on, a mix of spilled liquor, fried food, and the laughter of people who mistook cruelty for amusement. Helen Peterson sat at the far end of the table, her face calm, her eyes fixed ahead as though she were merely another aging veteran enduring the banter of the younger, louder crowd. But beneath the surface, every detail registered, the cadence of Susan Walker's sarcastic remarks, the drunken braying of Mike, Tom, and Rick, the subtle glances that darted between Susan and David Walker who had arrived later, dressed in a crisp shirt without a tie, sipping his beer with the ease of a man who thought he owned the room. For 20 years Helen had carried silence like a stone in her chest. Tonight that stone began to crack. She waited until the room had reached its peak noise, until glasses clinked and the men began to slur their words, until Susan leaned back smugly as though she had orchestrated a perfect play. Then, with the calm of a general about to launch an operation, Helen reached into her handbag and placed a small, battered flip phone onto the center of the table. Its plastic surface was worn, its screen dim, the kind of artifact most people would dismiss as junk. But the moment Susan's eyes landed on it, the false smile slipped ever so slightly. Helen did not announce it dramatically. She simply slid the phone forward with the same composure she might use to place a report on a desk. On the tiny screen, a single file name glowed faintly, Anna Scott, Final Recording, 2004. A silence fell over the table, sharp and sudden, cutting through the drunken haze. Susan froze, her hand hovering above her glass, her carefully maintained mask cracking as recognition flickered across her face. David squinted at the phone, then at Helen, a frown settling over his smug grin. Mike chuckled awkwardly, not understanding, but the tension in the room was palpable. Helen pressed a button, and a burst of static filled the space before a young woman's trembling voice emerged, fragile yet piercing. "Commander, I wanted to see you that day, but I was too scared. I had to do everything Susan told me. And Mr. David Walker. He." The voice broke, replaced by muffled sobs, then a moment of silence before the recording cut off. The men stopped laughing. Susan's knuckles whitened around her glass. David set down his beer with a thud, his eyes darting toward Susan as if demanding an explanation. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Then Helen's voice, low and steady, filled the space. "This is what I carried for 20 years. The voice of a recruit no one defended. You all pretended not to hear. You all pretended not to see. Tonight, that silence ends." Susan tried to recover, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Helen, really, dragging up old ghosts. This is inappropriate. We're here for a private dinner, not," but David cut her off, his voice sharp, betraying his panic. "You told me she didn't remember. You told me she was just some washed-up officer, not." He stopped himself too late, the words already spilled into the open. The room shifted. Every eye turned toward Helen. The revelation was not hers to declare anymore, David had confirmed it himself. Helen stood slowly, her posture commanding without a uniform, her presence unmistakable. "Yes," she said quietly. "I am General Helen Peterson. And tonight, you showed your true selves without me having to say a word." She reached into her bag again and this time pulled out a modern smartphone. With a single tap, she connected to the military police unit waiting nearby. "Commence recording," she said into the device. "For subjects, verbal confirmation obtained. Proceed in 5 minutes." The transformation of the room was immediate. Susan's carefully constructed calm dissolved, her lips trembling as she tried to form words. David lurched forward, his face pale, sweat breaking across his forehead. Mike, Tom, and Rick, suddenly realizing this was no longer a game, sat frozen in their seats, their earlier bravado vanished. Helen, meanwhile, remained unmoved, her gaze sweeping the table with the same clarity she had once used to survey a battlefield. "You thought memory fades," she said evenly. "You thought silence means consent. But silence is not forgiveness. It is simply waiting for the right moment." She turned her eyes on Susan. "Do you remember what you said to me 20 years ago, Susan? That no one would ever remember the report I filed, that no one would care about one recruit's death. You were wrong. I remembered. And now, everyone here will remember." The sound of car doors slamming outside pierced the silence. Through the tavern windows, headlights flashed. 2 vehicles stopped abruptly at the curb, a black van bearing the insignia of the U.S. Army Military Police, and a government sedan from the Department of Defense. The tavern doors swung open, and uniformed officers entered, their presence undeniable. Panic rippled through the table. David pushed back his chair, half rising as if to flee, but the nearest officer's voice was calm and firm. "Sir, you are a civilian. We need you to cooperate with us in an investigation into violations of national security protocols." David froze, his face draining of color. Susan tried one last time, her voice sharp, tinged with desperation. "Helen, you can't do this here, not like this. We were friends once. We trained together. That Girlinate was tragic, but it's in the past. Dragging it out now won't bring her back." Her words faltered under Helen's gaze, steady and unyielding. "If you had truly pitied her, Susan, you wouldn't have laughed when she cried. You wouldn't have turned away when she begged for help." Helen's voice carried the weight of 2 decades of restraint, and each word cut deeper than any accusation. The military police moved forward, identifying themselves formally. "Former Officer Susan Walker, you are under investigation for falsification of official documents and concealment of evidence in relation to a 2004 training incident. You are required to come with us for questioning." Susan's glass rattled as she set it down, her hand shaking. "This isn't over," she hissed, her eyes locked on Helen. "I have connections. I have people. You'll regret this." Helen's expression did not change. "You said 20 years ago that no one would remember. And maybe the world forgot. But I didn't. And that is enough." The officers escorted Susan and David toward the door. The tavern, once filled with noise, was now eerily silent, the only sounds the scrape of chairs and the shuffle of boots. The other women at the table, Olivia Carter, Irene Novak, and several others who had been cadets back then, sat frozen, their faces pale, some with guilt, some with shame. At last Irene found her voice. "Helen. I should have helped you back then. I saw things. I knew things. But I was afraid. My career seemed more important. I'm sorry." Helen turned to her, her expression neither angry nor forgiving, but calm, as if the burden of judgment had already passed. "Thank you for saying it now. Some will keep pretending they forgot. Some will cling to excuses until the end. But you remembered, and you admitted it. That matters. Outside, the night air carried the sound of engines starting as Susan and David were driven away under escort. Inside, the tavern was left in stunned silence. Helen returned to her seat, her hands folded neatly before her, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her former comrades. "This was never just a reunion," she said quietly. "It was a reckoning. And now, the silence of 20 years has finally been broken." The headlines hit the following morning like artillery fire. Every major outlet carried a variation of the same story: First Female Division Commander abuses authority. Pentagon General orders civilian arrest at private dinner. Newspapers in Washington splashed Helen Peterson's name across their political pages, and television anchors repeated the same soundbite until it was etched into the public's mind. A decorated officer had allegedly turned a private gathering into a stage for her personal vendetta. The narrative was slick, carefully polished, clearly fed by someone with connections. Susan Walker had wasted no time painting herself as the victim. Cameras caught her leaving the Pentagon Annex after her initial questioning, wearing a carefully chosen gray suit that softened her features, her voice trembling just enough as she told reporters she had been blindsided, humiliated, and deeply saddened that a woman she once trained with would use state power against civilians. Beside her, David Walker kept his silence, though the tension in his clenched jaw betrayed his fear. The public did not yet know about Anna Scott's recording. That piece of evidence remained locked inside Army channels. What the people saw instead was a charismatic former officer claiming she had been ambushed by a powerful general. Inside the Pentagon, Helen faced her own storm. Staffers whispered in hallways, aides exchanged glances, and some junior officers even questioned whether their commander had gone too far. At a morning briefing, a colonel cautiously suggested that her timing had been unfortunate. Another officer remarked that while the arrests were technically legal, the optics were terrible. Helen listened without interruption, her face composed, her hands folded on the table. When the room emptied, she whispered to herself words no one else could hear: "It is not the lie that terrifies, might is the way people twist themselves to protect it." That evening, Susan made her move on national television. Sitting beneath soft lights in a popular news studio in Washington, she spoke with perfect calibration. Her voice trembled as she said she had simply wanted to reconnect with old friends, that she had no idea Helen was now a general, and that she certainly never expected military police to storm a private tavern. She described the experience as degrading, frightening, and unjust. The interviewer leaned forward sympathetically, asking if she thought Helen had a personal grudge. Susan lowered her eyes just long enough, then answered, "I don't know what demons she carries, but what happened to me was not justicide, was abuse." The performance was flawless, and in the following hours, hashtags began to trend. Social media divided itself, some defended Helen, citing her integrity and career, but many questioned her judgment, asking whether she had truly crossed a line. At the same time, inside Helen's office, a different kind of evidence began to surface. Anonymous emails reached the Department of Defense's internal portal. Old documents, forgotten logs, and fragments of surveillance footage from Fort Liberty's training center in 2004 trickled in. One contained excerpts from Anna Scott's journal, her handwriting shaky but clear: "I am afraid. I don't know who to trust. Susan tells me I have to obey. Mr. Walker comes at night. If anyone finds this, please remember me." Another included disciplinary reports quietly altered, with Susan's signature marking them as non-issues. Though unofficial, these leaks began to spread across military forums and veteran networks. The question shifted: had the general truly abused her power, or had she finally forced the army to confront a truth it had buried? Within days, Irene Novak, the once silent lieutenant, stepped forward. Standing in front of a camera with her uniform pressed, she gave a sworn statement: "I saw the bruises on Anna Scott's wrists. I heard her cries. I knew something was wrong, but I stayed quiet because I was afraid of losing my career. That silence has haunted me for 20 years." General Peterson did not act out of vengeance, she acted out of responsibility. Her testimony, raw and trembling, spread online, and for the first time the tide of public opinion began to shift. Susan fought back with every tool at her disposal. She hired attorneys who filed complaints of misconduct, accusing Helen of misusing state resources. She courted sympathetic journalists, feeding them half-truths, framing herself as the target of a jealous superior. "Why now?" she asked during another interview, her eyes glistening. "Why after 2 decades does Helen decide to drag my name through the mud? If there was truth to her claims, wouldn't it have been addressed back then?" It was a clever argument, one that played on the public's natural suspicion of delayed justice. For a moment, she gained traction again. But then, late one night, an anonymous video appeared on the Department of Defense's official YouTube channel. It was titled simply, "The Forgotten Recruit, 2004. The video contained restored fragments of Anna's final voicemail, pages from her diary, and redacted portions of Helen's original report. No commentary, no editorializing, just dates, facts, and documents laid bare. The silence that followed online was louder than any argument. Comment sections filled not with ridicule but with outrage. Why are we only learning this now? 20 years ago there was someone who spoke up, and she was punished. How many others stayed silent? By dawn, newspapers had changed their tone. Where once Helen had been portrayed as a power-hungry general, now she was described as a soldier carrying an unbearable truth. Susan, watching the tide shift, doubled down. She convened a press conference of her own, seated in front of cameras with carefully disheveled hair and just the right touch of exhaustion in her makeup. "I am being smeared with baseless accusations," she declared. But when a reporter asked her directly whether she had signed off on the falsified disciplinary logs, her hesitation lasted just a second too long. That pause was clipped, circulated, replayed, dissected frame by frame until millions had seen the flicker of panic in her eyes. Meanwhile, in the Pentagon, Helen prepared for her first public statement. Her aides urged her to issue clarifications, to counter Susan's narrative point by point. Helen refused. "The truth does not need explanation," she told them quietly. "Those who need to know already see it. Those who refuse to believe will not be convinced by words." When she finally stood at the podium before a room full of journalists, she did not carry a script. Her voice was steady as she began, "What happened at Old Town Tavern was not about me. It was about Anna Scott, a recruit who died on August 3, 2004, 10 days after being discharged. For 20 years, her voice was buried. That night, I chose to honor it." She paused as cameras clicked, as pens stopped moving. "The civilian who struck me that night had been recorded in 2004 as an unauthorized contractor. The officer who enabled him falsified reports. Those are not my opinions, they are documented facts. Whether the world is ready to face them is not my concern. What matters is that Anna Scott is remembered." The words rippled outward. In living rooms, on phones, across bases, people listened. For some, it was the first time they had ever heard Anna's name. For others, it was the reminder of something they had tried to bury. The reaction was not unanimous, criticism remained fierce. But something had shifted. The debate was no longer about whether Helen had abused her authority, it was about how the army had once silenced a truth too painful to confront. That evening, the Pentagon released a formal statement. The Department of Defense had opened a full reinvestigation into the events of 2004. The announcement named names. Former officer Susan Walker and all personnel who certified the falsified report are under review. Alongside it came another line: consideration is being given to awarding Major General Helen Peterson the Order of Merit for service in pursuit of truth. Helen did not celebrate. She did not appear on television, did not give interviews, did not smile for the cameras. She returned to her office, opened her drawer, and placed inside it a letter she had received that afternoon from an anonymous sender. It contained nothing but an old photograph of 3 women in uniform, herself, Susan, and Anna in the center, smiling shyly. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, "Thank you for remembering her." Helen closed her eyes, the noise of the city outside muffled, and allowed herself a single moment of stillness. For the first time in 2 decades, she did not feel entirely alone. The weeks that followed were a storm of narratives colliding, headlines sparring with each other as if the truth itself were another contestant in a televised debate. Susan Walker, unbowed by her initial exposure, fought with a desperation that looked almost graceful on screen. She appeared on talk shows with carefully rehearsed lines, her voice quivering in just the right places, insisting that she had been set up by a bitter rival, painting herself as the embodiment of resilience against institutional betrayal. Her lawyers filed complaints, accusing Helen Petersen of leaking classified files, manipulating evidence, and conducting what they called a personal crusade masquerading as justice. She knew exactly how to frame herself, a woman wronged not by circumstance, but by the vendetta of another woman who had outpaced her in rank. In America, where public opinion could turn into a weapon sharper than any sword, Susan wielded her narrative with precision. Meanwhile, Helen chose silence. She gave no interviews, avoided television, and issued only the most concise official statements when required. To some, her restraint was infuriating. Reporters called her cold, distant, arrogant. Social media filled with speculation: if she was truly innocent, why wasn't she defending herself? Why wasn't she fighting back? Yet to others, that very silence became a symbol. Veterans who remembered her service spoke up online, describing her as a woman who had always acted with discipline, never with recklessness. Young officers whispered stories of her leadership, of the way she walked the barracks at night to make sure the most junior soldiers felt safe. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the conversation began to shift. The turning point came when Irene Novak released her full testimony on video. Standing stiffly in a small press room, her uniform impeccable, she looked directly into the camera and said, "I failed Anna Scott. I watched her suffer, and I did nothing. I chose my career over my conscience. General Petersen tried to tell the truth 20 years ago, and we all abandoned her. I am here today to say that she was right, and we were wrong." The rawness of the admission broke through the static of media spin. Within hours, the clip had gone viral, shared not just by military forums but by ordinary citizens who recognized the courage it took to confess such a long-held guilt. Hashtags that once condemned Helen now turned into messages of solidarity: "Remember Anna," "Truth After Silence," "We Believe Petersen." Susan counterattacked quickly, summoning another press conference. She sat at a polished wooden table, her expression strained but still calculated. "I understand that emotions run high," she said. "But emotions cannot replace facts. We must not allow ourselves to be manipulated by regretful memories or convenient leaks. Justice is not about who cries louder, it is about evidence." Her argument resonated with some, especially those wary of institutions rewriting history to cover their tracks. For a moment, the battlefield of opinion seemed evenly split. Then came the unexpected blow. An anonymous group of active-duty female sergeants published an open letter online. It read simply, "We believe Major General Helen Petersen. She showed us that silence is not the same as weakness. Her actions remind us that responsibility sometimes means carrying a truth no one wants to hear. She did not act for herself. She acted for the memory of Anna Scott." The letter was not sanctioned, not official, but it spread across forums, social networks, and eventually into mainstream media. It became a rallying cry. Citizens who had never served began signing digital petitions demanding a full investigation into the 2004 incident. Activists began citing Helen's case as proof of systemic cover-ups. Susan's allies in the media tried to paint the letter as orchestrated propaganda, but the authenticity of the soldier's words rang too true to be dismissed. Interviews with veterans who had never met Helen confirmed the pattern: women in uniform describing harassment, silence, and the fear of speaking up. The story was no longer about two women in conflict. It had become a mirror reflecting an entire institution's buried scars. Inside the Pentagon, pressure mounted. Helen was summoned to the Department of Defense's Internal Review Board. A deputy assistant secretary, his tone formal but cautious, told her, "If you issue a public apology, even a carefully worded one, this will all quiet down. It may not clear your name, but it will defuse the firestorm. Helen read the document placed before her, a draft apology that danced around words like misunderstanding and overstep. She held the paper for a long moment, then picked up a pen and wrote only one line at the bottom: "Silence does not mean I was wrong." The official who received it looked at her, speechless, then quietly folded the paper and placed it back into the file. Outside, Susan continued to maneuver. She met privately with journalists, offering exclusive interviews in lavish restaurants in downtown Washington. One journalist later admitted off-camera that Susan had whispered, "Even if I lose, she cannot be allowed to win. If I lose, she takes everything I ever was." Her desperation leaked into her public appearances, though. In one interview, when pressed about her signature on the altered disciplinary logs, she paused too long, her eyes flickering with panic. That pause, clipped and shared online, became the single most damaging piece of footage in her campaign. Helen remained steady. She walked her base at Fort Liberty with the same quiet diligence she had carried for decades. When a young captain nervously approached her in the mess hall, asking why she didn't simply explain herself to the press, she answered softly, "The truth does not require explanation. Those who must see it will. Those who refuse will not, no matter what I say." The truth wins not because lies are weak, but because eventually people grow tired of carrying them. The words were overheard, repeated, and soon circulated as a kind of unofficial credo among her supporters. The climax of the battle came when the Pentagon's official YouTube channel uploaded a second video, this time titled, "The Testimony of a Silent Witness." It featured Irene Novak's statement in full, accompanied by documents verifying her service at Fort Liberty during 2004. This was no longer rumor, no longer anonymous leaks. It was an official acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong. The views skyrocketed, the comments filled with outrage, and the media, sensing the shift, turned their cameras back toward Susan with sharper questions. Her charm began to falter. For the first time, Helen felt the weight she had carried for so long begin to shift. Not disappear, never disappear, but lighten, as if others had finally reached out to hold it with her. She knew the war was far from over. There would be more attacks, more attempts to twist the story. But the silence had been broken. People were speaking. And for the first time in 20 years, the name Anna Scott was being spoken not in hushed guilt, but in open recognition. The announcement came quietly at first, a brief line buried in the Pentagon's daily press release: "A full reinvestigation into the circumstances surrounding the death of recruit Anna Scott, 2004, has been authorized." But within hours, the statement was everywhere. Major news outlets carried it as breaking news, social media erupted with commentary, and television pundits debated endlessly over what it meant. For 20 years, Anna's name had been a ghost haunting a handful of memories. Now it was in headlines across America. Helen Peterson read the release alone in her office at Fort Liberty, the words stark on the page. She did not smile, did not let triumph cross her features. Justice was not a medal to pin on her chest, it was the slow unraveling of silence, the steady resurfacing of a truth long buried. Susan Walker's name appeared alongside the announcement. She and other officers who had certified the falsified report were officially listed as persons of interest under review. The phrasing was clinical, but the weight was undeniable. Susan's attempt to spin herself as the victim cracked. Reporters swarmed her outside her Arlington condominium, shouting questions about signatures, about Anna, about David Walker's role. For the first time, Susan looked genuinely shaken. Cameras caught her snapping at a journalist, her mask slipping, her carefully curated image of composure replaced by visible anger. The clip spread instantly, another nail in her public coffin. Inside the Pentagon, senior officials debated not just the reinvestigation but how to publicly handle Helen. Some argued she deserved reprimand for the spectacle at Old Town Tavern, for dragging military police into what had been framed as a private dinner. Others insisted that without her actions, Anna Scott's case would have remained buried forever. A draft commendation was prepared, recognizing Helen for service in pursuit of truth and integrity. It was not finalized, but the fact it existed at all signaled a shift. For the first time in her career, Helen's defiance was not seen as insubordination, it was seen as leadership. The letters began to arrive soon after. Some were typed, others handwritten, many unsigned. They came from across the country, women who had served and left in silence, men who admitted they had seen things and stayed quiet, citizens who had never worn a uniform but felt compelled to write. I wish I had someone like you when I served. I was Anna once, but I survived. Your silence taught me that strength is not in shouting, but in enduring. Helen stored them in a drawer in her office, reading them late at night when the weight of everything pressed too heavily on her shoulders. Each letter was a reminder that the fight was not just about Anna, it was about all of them. Meanwhile, Susan maneuvered desperately. She launched her final media offensive, appearing on a primetime network with the headline, "Betrayed by a Friend, Destroyed by Lies." She accused Helen of orchestrating a smear campaign, claimed the documents had been altered, argued that Anna's death, while tragic, had nothing to do with misconduct. But the nation was no longer listening in the same way. The leaked video of Anna's final voicemail, the diary pages, Irene Novak's testimony, all of it had already taken root in public consciousness. The more Susan spoke, the more hollow her words sounded. In one particularly damning moment, a reporter interrupted her, "Ms. Walker, do you deny that you altered the disciplinary log?" Her hesitation was only 2 seconds, but it was enough. The silence said what she could not. The reinvestigation gathered momentum quickly. Subpoenas were issued, documents unsealed, witnesses called. David Walker, once smug and untouchable, was now described in official language as a civilian contractor under review for violations of ethical conduct. His name, once obscure, was now infamous. Veterans who had served at Fort Liberty in 2004 began to come forward, some anonymously, others on record. Stories of harassment, of pressure, of whispered warnings spread. Each testimony, each document added weight to the avalanche building against Susan and her circle. Helen, for her part, did not bask in the unfolding vindication. She continued her routine, inspecting the barracks, speaking quietly with young officers, reviewing reports. When one of her captains asked if she was relieved that the truth was finally surfacing, she answered simply, "Relief is for those who finish the fight. The fight is not over." Her calm refusal to gloat became another layer of her legend. To the soldiers around her, she was not just their general, she was the embodiment of resilience, the quiet proof that truth could outlast lies. Recognition came quietly, almost reluctantly. The Pentagon issued a statement praising Major General Helen Peterson's unwavering commitment to the principles of accountability. Weeks later, at a closed ceremony, she was awarded the Order of Merit. Helen accepted without ceremony, placing the medal not on her uniform but in the same drawer where she kept the letters. For her, it belonged not on her chest but in the archive of memory, beside Anna's name. The reinvestigation reached its peak when Susan was officially indicted for falsification of documents and obstruction of justice. Her fall was dramatic. Once the polished officer who had glided effortlessly into civilian success, she now stood grim and pale before cameras, flanked by lawyers, denying charges even as the evidence mounted. Public sympathy, once carefully cultivated, evaporated. The nation that had once listened to her tears now watched with cold detachment. Justice was not fast, but it was steady. For Helen, the moment that mattered most did not come in the form of medals or headlines. It came on a rainy Saturday when she traveled quietly to Arlington National Cemetery. She wore no dress uniform, only plain fatigues and a dark raincoat, carrying a small envelope. She found Anna Scott's grave, a modest headstone etched with her name and dates. Kneeling in the wet grass, Helen placed a tarnished unit insignia, the one she had once worn as Anna's commander, in the stone. "Anna," she whispered, "I couldn't protect you then. But I never forgot you." The rain drummed softly on her shoulders as if answering. Behind her, footsteps approached. 3 women stood silently: Olivia Carter, Irene Novak, and another former comrade who had once turned away. None of them spoke. They simply stood behind Helen, forming a quiet guard. One of them removed her own jacket and placed it gently on Helen's shoulders, murmuring, "Now we'll protect you, General." Helen closed her eyes, not distinguishing between the rain and her tears. For 20 years she had carried the weight alone. Now, finally, she was not alone. Justice restored did not mean the story ended. Helen knew there would be appeals, spin, new attempts to twist perception. She knew the public's attention would shift, that the world was fickle. But as she rose from Anna's grave, shoulders squared, she felt something she had not felt in 2 decades, peace, fragile but real. Justice was not perfect. It was not neat. But it had come, and it had remembered Anna's name. That was enough. In the months that followed, the frenzy of headlines began to subside. The public, always hungry for the next scandal, slowly turned its attention to new controversies and fresh debates, leaving the story of Anna Scott to settle into history. Yet for Helen Peterson, the echoes remained constant, as persistent as her own heartbeat. Each day she carried on with her duties at Fort Liberty, reviewing reports, walking the barracks, mentoring young officers, but the silence of the corridors no longer felt as heavy. The weight that had defined her for 20 years was no longer hers alone to bear. Others carried it now too, and in their voices, their letters, their testimonies, she heard Anna's memory return not as a whisper but as a living presence. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the sky over Virginia in streaks of red and gold, Helen sat in her office reading a new letter. This one was different from the others. It came from a young private who had enlisted only 6 months earlier. "General Peterson," it read in neat, careful handwriting, "I never met Anna Scott, but I know her story because of you. When I felt afraid during training, I thought of her, and it gave me strength. You gave her voice back, and through that, you gave us courage. Thank you." Helen folded the letter and placed it beside the others in her drawer, her hand lingering for a moment on the stack. The collection had grown into a monument of its own, a testament that memory could be restored, not erased. Justice had been served in courts and hearings, in indictments and convictions, but Helen knew true justice lived not in documents but in remembrance. And remembrance was finally returning. At military academies across the country, Anna Scott's story was incorporated into training sessions on ethics and accountability. Cadets who had once memorized battle strategies and tactical doctrines now also studied the cost of silence, the price of turning away. In classrooms, instructors spoke her name aloud, Anna Scott, a recruit who should have been forgotten but who now stood as a warning and a symbol. Helen never attended these lectures, but she heard about them through whispers, through proud young officers who stopped her in hallways and said, "Ma'am, we talked about Anna today." Each time, Helen nodded silently, gratitude swelling beneath her disciplined exterior. Susan Walker, once the smiling face of denial, faded into the shadows of public life. Her trial dragged on, appeals filed and rejected, her name attached to charges that stripped away the last fragments of her carefully built reputation. No one invited her onto talk shows anymore. No cameras followed her into court. She had become what she had once mocked, a figure remembered not for charm or ambition but for complicity. David Walker, too, vanished from the spotlight, his contract severed, his name blacklisted. The system that had protected them for so long finally discarded them, leaving them to the obscurity they had once feared. Helen did not celebrate their downfall. For her, their ruin was not victory, it was merely the absence of further harm. It was Anna she thought of most often, especially in the quiet hours before dawn when the base was still and the world seemed to hold its breath. Sometimes she imagined Anna walking beside her through the hallways of Fort Liberty, no longer a frightened recruit but a woman who might have lived, served, and thrived. Sometimes she imagined what Anna might have become, a sergeant, a teacher, a leader. The images were bittersweet, but they no longer pierced her with the same raw pain. Instead, they carried a strange comfort, as if remembering Anna not only honored her but allowed Helen to live with her instead of for her. One spring morning, Helen was invited to speak at West Point. She considered declining the spotlight had never been her aim, but eventually she agreed. Standing before hundreds of cadets in their immaculate gray uniforms, she spoke with the same calm clarity she had used her entire career. She did not recount the details of Susan's trial or the chaos of the media storm. Instead, she told them about Anna. She spoke of a young recruit who had once believed no one would listen, who had been abandoned by those she trusted, and who had died unheard. She told them about the silence that followed, the years of exile, the weight of carrying a truth no one wanted to face. And then she told them about the moment when memory returned, when the world finally chose to remember. The auditorium was silent, cadets leaning forward, their youthful faces solemn. Helen concluded with words that had become her creed: silence is not forgiveness. Silence is not weakness. It is waiting. And if you carry the truth long enough, it will find its way back into the world. The applause that followed was not thunderous, not wild. It was steady, respectful, a rhythm that echoed through the hall. Helen left the stage knowing that Anna's name had been spoken in the very heart of the institution that had once abandoned her. That, she thought, was justice restored in its truest form. Years later, when Helen finally retired, she moved to a quiet house on the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The world had changed, new conflicts had risen, new names filled the news, but in her study she kept the same drawer, filled with letters, documents, and one small photograph of 3 women in uniform. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, were the words, "Thank you for remembering her." She would sit by the window on quiet afternoons, looking out at the ridges bathed in sunlight, and think of the long road from silence to remembrance. The world might forget again someday, such was the nature of memory, but Helen knew she never would. On her final visit to Arlington National Cemetery, she walked slowly through the rows of headstones until she reached Anna's. Kneeling, she brushed the grass from the stone, her hand steady. "Anna," she whispered, "they remember you now. You are not forgotten." She stayed there until the sun dipped low, until the shadows grew long, until the air itself seemed to carry the weight of memory. Then she rose, her posture still straight, her gaze still clear, and walked away with the certainty that what had once been silence was now a voice that would never fade. The return of memory was not a moment. It was not a trial or a headline or even a medal. It was a slow, steady rising of voices, a chorus that began with one and grew until it filled the air. And in that chorus, Helen finally heard what she had been waiting for all along, the sound of Anna Scott's name, carried by others, alive again in the world.